Your time and attention today. My name is James Quintero. I'm the director of the Center for Local Governance and expert at knocking down water bottles. So I have to admit, when senior staff first approached me with the idea of hosting a sharing economy panel, which is something we've never done before, I, of course, jumped at the idea. And I jumped at it because this is finally my opportunity to corner Trevor and ask him all of those burning questions I have about autonomous aerial vehicles. So he has no choice but to respond now. But before we head down that rabbit trail, and we'll get there, trust me, I want to set the stage for today's panel. Where does Texas's sharing economy go from here? And for those of you who may have stumbled into the room accidentally, let me first define what is the sharing economy. This is a good definition that I found from the Brookings Institution, and they effectively define it as such: the peer-to-peer based activity of obtaining, giving, or sharing access to goods and services. That's a pretty wonkish way to basically say it's a system where individuals can share themselves and their stuff using the internet. So it's a really interesting, the emergence of a really interesting ecosystem that raises all kinds of public policy questions about the intersection of government and technology. And I want to stress this system is really big, right? So according to this same Brookings Institute study, they found that in 2014, the measure of all sharing economy activities measured about $14 billion. So just a few years ago. Now, within the span of a decade, in 2025, this study projects that that measure will grow by about 25 times to total $335 billion worth of economic goods and services exchange. So we're talking about a massive segment of the economy that is burgeoning and blossoming in all kinds of new and innovative ways. And so I think in my kind of simplistic overview of the issue, I think there are two big tentacles that come out of the sharing economy. One is, of course, on the ride-sharing front, where people effectively rent out their vehicles and for transport. And you have the home sharing sector, where people effectively rent out their homes on a short-term basis. And so I want to really focus our energy and attention today on those two elements, both of which I think continue to grow and prosper here in Texas, in spite of some local governments' public policy making. So having kind of wet everyone's palates with that, let me introduce our absolutely stellar group of public policy makers and public policy shakers. So first off, we have at the far end of the panel someone who needs very little introduction. She has been defending liberty and promoting conservatism in the hardest of places. Please help me welcome Austin City Council member Ellen Troxclair. So we are also privileged to have a member of industry here with us representing Uber, who is easily my favorite ride-sharing service. Please help me welcome Trevor Theunissen, who leads the public affairs lead for Uber. So please help me welcome Trevor. We have a member of the Texas Senate here today who is easily one of my favorites. He has done all sorts of amazing things in the upper chamber to advance liberty and to move the ball forward in very, very good ways. Please help me welcome Senator Don Huffines. And then certainly, last but not least, we have another industry expert with us who is no stranger to Texas politics. In her previous life, she worked as a government relations liaison for the Texas Workforce Commission. but is now a very well-established industry expert for HomeAway. Please help me welcome Miss Ashley Hodgini. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let me ask our panel of experts, when it comes to the sharing economy, how would you rate how Texas's public policy environment? Senator Huffines, would you?
Okay. Well, I'll start. But first, I'd like to say and start out how important it is that we have economic liberty. It's every bit as important as our personal liberty. And that's the lens I'll look through, and hopefully that's where most of the legislators will look through. And I like to say on that front, who do you trust more to make the best decisions for yourself? 181 know-it-alls in the legislature or millions of consumers in the state of Texas? And I trust millions of Texans to make that decision. I believe totally in the free market, and that's what's so important, is capitalism and the free market. And people forget often that the free market is disruptive. Capitalism's not only disruptive, but it's unorganized, it's chaotic. Companies go broke, but they're supposed to go broke, right? That's what makes capitalism so great, when we pick up the pieces from malfeasant investments and then we make money from that. And so often, people come to the legislature or they'll go to Washington and they say, we don't like that disorderliness, right? We want to keep companies from going broke. Or they'll come down and legislate away their competition. We've been doing that for decades in Austin. But it's all going to come to an end, I hope. And I will fight continuously for a real pure free market and level the playing field for everyone. So where's Texas going? I hope that's where Texas is going. Thank you for the question, James.
Councilmember, how would you say Texas rates in terms of handling the sharing economy? Are we doing a decent job?
Yeah, I guess I have probably a unique perspective being from Austin, where we have such heavy-handed government regulation with the sharing economy. So I, for one, am very grateful to the state, to the legislators in the House and the Senate who have kind of recognized when there has been an overreach at the local level and have stepped in to protect the free market. You know, a lot of people have questioned, well, local control, isn't that one of the principles that conservatives believe in? And sure, but it's a means to an end, right? Local control is valuable because the government closest to the people is the government that is most likely to protect your freedom. And so when that's not the case, and when instead the local government is being used to restrict people's freedom, and the economy, then I think it's absolutely appropriate for the state to step in. And there's such a difference between the local government telling you that you can't do something, you or a business, and the state saying to the local government, you can't prohibit somebody from doing something. So, you know, we didn't make as much progress as I would have hoped on the short-term rental front, but very grateful to have Uber and Lyft back in Austin because of the Texas legislature.
Ashley, how would you say Texas fares in this front?
Better than most, but there's always room for improvement.
Yeah.
At the local level, we suffer from a lot of the same issues that many states are struggling with, especially states that are growing rapidly in population and states that are popular tourist destinations. But from a state level, I think our legislature has a strong history of standing up for economic liberties and market freedoms and personal property rights. So I remain hopeful.
Good, me too. Trevor?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, Uber has had our fair share of struggles here locally in Austin and in a few cities around the state. But the legislature took an important step this past session in passing HB 100, which was authored by Representative Patty, and really made ride-sharing regulations consistent across the state and joined 46 other states in doing so. I think the importance for us in that regard was that, you know, 1 in every 4 Uber trips in Texas ends in a different city than it began. And so we were crossing jurisdictional boundaries 1 in every 4 trips. And that made a very difficult regulatory environment, not only for us as a company, but for our drivers and riders to understand what the rules were on the road in various cities. And so We had said that if the legislature and the governor signed a statewide ride-sharing bill, that we would be able to expand to rural areas that we never expected to even go to, and into other areas of the state that didn't have access to TNC services. So I'm happy to report that we've expanded almost to the entire state as of today. We've brought rideshare and consumer choice to more than 6 million Texans that had it prior to HB 100 passing, and we should be lighting up the entire state sometime later this year.
And I think the passage of that particular bill is the culmination of something really unique here in the state, where you saw the legislature rightfully step in and pass a bill that effectively took away a lot of bad local regulations. And Senator, I know you were at the tip of the spear on that particular effort. Can you tell us a little bit about the bill that you put forward, which I thought was an excellent bill, and then where we ultimately landed?
Absolutely. First, I want to thank the city of Austin for being the catalyst to getting HB 100 done. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be up here. But, so a little bit overreach there. We had 3 main bills we worked on last session to deregulate and preempt the ride-sharing, preempt political subdivisions and for ride-sharing, and mine was one of them. Mine was a more of a total free market approach. I wanted to deregulate taxi cabs and limousines and put everybody on a level playing field. The bill we got done was pretty good. Wasn't as good as my bill, but it was pretty good. We can always go back and clean up some of it. Some of the things in there that I think need cleaning up. We still allowed airports to charge Uber or any TNC company for using their facilities, and we still have some fees and things like that. I look at it this way. We need to really open up the market completely, not only for ride sharing, but this goes really across the board for everything. And I want to point out that it was all because of these, right? It's all because of the cell phone that we have. We're even up here talking about sharing anything, and this industry is in its infancy, right? This is the very beginning, and when we're in a period of history, you know, when it's significant historic events are transpiring, we often don't notice that when you're in it. You don't think, oh, wow, this is so unique, we're in it. We're having most transformational things happening in our society right now we've happened in 100 years. We were riding horses for a millennium. We had trains for 200 years. We had cars for 100 years. And no significant changes. Ride sharing with vehicles is the first significant change to come around. Now we're going to have drones. We're going to have the Hyperloop. We're going to have driverless vehicles. All of that. If you said 15 years ago that you could get in a car without a steering wheel, or even 10 years ago without any steering wheel or anything like that, well, you would have thought you were crazy. You might have thought maybe 2050, but not 2025. So the point is, what you're experiencing today, and you said it's going to be a $300 billion economic, it could easily be 10 times that 20 years from now, because it's just now starting. So,
Trevor, was industry fairly satisfied with the product that came out of the legislature?
Yeah, look, I mean, we supported HB 100 because we were wanting consistent rules across the state, but we'll support Senator Huffines on deregulating taxi and limo and others at the state level, because we think, we embrace competition. We think consumers will ultimately choose the better and cheaper product. And we've been saying from day one when we got into this fight locally with taxi companies is, let's just have a level playing field. If that's what you want, let's do it across the board. Mm-hmm. And they had benefited for quite some time from over-regulation, which created a monopoly that kept others out. And so if you want a true free market consumer choice, let's all have it. And so, yeah, we're certainly pleased. I mean, obviously it's a good first step. And, what I tell people is that this technology, not only ride sharing, but autonomous vehicles and flying cars, the technology is changing so quickly from a month to month, to quarter to year basis. And if you pigeonhole regulation to fit what's happening today, then you're going to put Texas behind on those companies coming here to do that innovation and technology. So, the sharing economy is big for us, not only from ride sharing, but from autonomous vehicles. We don't envision a world where individuals own self-driving vehicles. We envision a world where people are sharing self-driving vehicles, and self-driving vehicles are being put on the Uber platform. So you'll push a button on your phone and a self-driving vehicle will come and pick you up and drop you off and pick up others on the way and drop them off. And so for us, sharing economy is a big part of how people are going to be transported across urban and rural areas, and it's important that we get the regulations right, but not restrict things that we can't even contemplate that may be here in the future.
You know, you said something that really brought to mind something that I thought was revealing. During the last legislative session, of course, we were very much in favor of this push, but it seemed to me that we had trouble bringing our taxi cab companies into the arena, and they seem to enjoy the status quo, as opposed to want to come under a more relaxed regulatory environment. Was that your experience too?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we've gone round and round. Obviously, it's been high profile with taxi companies and other incumbent transportation providers. But yeah, certainly. I mean, they benefited from a large scheme that was at the local level where they were protected by the regulations, and it prevented competition. I think that was. I started Uber 3 years ago, and 3 years ago I was going to city councils all over the South, basically pleading and begging to educate them on what this new technology would do. And I think if I went back and interviewed all those city council members from 3 years ago, they'd say we had no idea what this was going to become. And so, I think it's important to make sure that when we're doing these regulations that we're taking all that into account. And look, self-driving vehicles, and we've announced that flying vehicles will be in Dallas in 2023. So, we're working on regulation for that. And we need to be thinking about that and how we move people and not getting tied up in this kind of in the weeds stuff that really, will be, non-existent in a few years. Yeah,
Senator, is that a legislative push that you see materializing next session with respect to taxi cabs?
I hope so.
Yeah,
I hope so. And look, they came down to the legislature years ago to legislate away their competition, and they were real good at it.
Councilmember, I have to bring you in here because 2 years ago we shared a stage, and I believe it was right before a big election involving Uber and Lyft. And at the time, I know there was a lot of angst over the election and whatnot, and some people were happy to see Uber go, some people were not happy to see Uber go. Can you give me a sense of what your constituents are saying now about the return of Uber, now that the legislature has taken action?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think immediately following the passage of the legislation and Uber and Lyft's return to Austin, people were just happy that they could use the app again, happy that they could, find a ride to wherever they were needing to go. I don't know. I mean, I think the vast majority of people weren't necessarily involved in what every single detail was at the local level. It was quite a long and complicated ordeal with Proposition 1 and the referendum and kind of all of the campaign shenanigans that went on with that. But ultimately, what I heard from my constituents is, why can I not use this app anymore, and how can I get it back? And once those services were back in the city, I think people are happy to have them back. During that time, it was so interesting. One of the mayor's talking points that really stuck out to me is he kept saying that government was innovating too fast for Uber and Lyft. I mean, repeatedly, that that they left the city because they just couldn't keep up with how incredibly innovative this city was, which of course was not only a complete misunderstanding of how the free economy works, but also just a complete underestimation of the intelligence of the average consumer. And overestimation of the companies that were trying to fill the gaps. We did have companies that startups and other ride-sharing companies that came in, but ultimately they weren't reliable. They couldn't scale to meet demand in a timely manner. Their business models simply didn't make sense, or they were being highly subsidized. And of course, when Uber and Lyft came back, people returned to their preferred services. So yeah, all that to say, it was kind of a textbook example of how government is not the innovator. Our government's job is to kind of stay out of the way so that the private sector can innovate and yeah, just try to keep up.
So speaking of government getting in the way, you know, one of the things that the Austin City Council is right now preparing to potentially pass is an ordinance enacting requirements for employers to provide paid sick leave to employees. And based on my very layman's understanding of the ordinance, I think this may affect Uber. Is that?
Yeah, from what I understand, as it's currently written, independent contractors are not excluded. So this is everything from real estate agents to Uber and Lyft drivers to your nanny. And there's no exception for based on the size of the business either. So we're taking the vote next week, but it's very possible that the city of Austin will be requiring mandatory paid sick leave for every worker in Austin, which will hugely impact our small businesses and our families, to be honest. So we'll see how that conversation goes. I think to the senator's point earlier, I think that other cities, small businesses in other cities may have the city of Austin to thank when the Texas legislature ultimately comes in and passes preemptive legislation.
Trevor, is that issue on y'all's radar?
Yeah, it certainly is on our radar, and you know, all of our drivers are independent contractors, and so you know, as we're going through and evaluating the proposal that's in front of Councilmember Troxclair and her colleagues, we're certainly concerned and paying attention. But yeah, it's always a. I think, you know, there are many different ways that it's in front of the U.S. Ninth Circuit right now, a case out of Seattle where the Seattle City Council passed a mandatory collective bargaining for all independent contractor T&C drivers, which was appealed to the Ninth Circuit. There were oral arguments on it yesterday. So there are all these kind of various cities across the country looking at ways to influence the independent contractor relationship. And that has massive implications for the sharing economy. And you know, we constantly poll our drivers, and the number one thing that they love about driving for Uber is flexibility and being their own boss. And that goes away with if you take away the independent contractor status. And so it's a massive issue that we pay attention to for sure.
Is this an issue that? Is this another issue where you may see preemption legislation emerge next session in an attempt to kind of rein in some of these excesses? Is this?
I think so.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Look, throughout history, the biggest threat to technology, particularly disruptive technology, is government. And it's going to be the same in ride sharing or Airbnb. It's government. Government's the biggest threat. So, I really embrace the free markets, and I think part of the problem we have is that we don't really educate people in leadership about what a free market really is or isn't and the benefits of it. I mean, my son actually drove for Uber. I'm not giving an Uber commercial, but I have 5 children. One of them made part-time money driving for Uber, and one of my other sons rented his apartment out here in Austin when he was at UT for Airbnb. So I personally know firsthand the benefits for the sharing economy.
Ashley, thank goodness home sharing doesn't face any of these challenges.
Thank God.
Can you give us for those of us who aren't well-versed in kind of the home sharing effort, can you bring us up to speed on what happened in the last legislative session and maybe what prompted those efforts?
Sure, absolutely. So to the Senator's earlier point, renting out a vacation rental is not a new concept. It's something that all of us have done for probably decades when we go on vacation with our families, or if we have a second home or a ranch or a beach house somewhere. It's not new, but it's the advent of technology that has caused this industry to surface and become more popular and more easily accessible, and presents a much broader variety of consumer and traveler choice. So with that, of course, came the complication of local regulation. A lot of the regulatory interest for personal property falls to local zoning codes and local zoning changes. So that's been problematic. In Austin is just one example, of course, of a handful of cities, I think, that have maybe taken it a step too far. And Austin was actually one of the first cities in the nation to pass comprehensive regulation for short-term rentals. And their first program was wildly successful. It established definitions for the activity, established a registry, established tax liability for operators. It became a model for other cities across the nation, such as Nashville, such as Seattle, and some of the other cities that we're looking into kind of grappling with this sort of new concept. And with that program, all accounts, according to staff, was an extremely high compliance rate, because imagine that, you make a program that's simple and easy to understand and people comply with it sort of automatically. And then we ran into some issues after the change of government. And we saw the new council, of course, with respect to Councilmember Troxclair, she's always been a wonderful champion for these issues. We saw the new council sort of dismantle a lot of the really strong economic development policies that our previous council had put in place, and short-term rentals were a casualty of that. So they completely prohibit you from renting your home if it's not your primary residence, meaning if you don't live there full-time and it's not your homestead, you don't get to do it. And you know, it's been really problematic for hundreds, thousands probably, of Austin homeowners who, in good faith, obtained a permit, a lawful permit from the city, and were told this is totally legal, this is totally kosher, move forward with your operation. And then a couple years later, the city came back and said, just kidding. After all of that investment and time, and in a lot of circumstances, somebody's whole livelihood had been invested into their homes. So it's a challenge, but we've seen several states pass preemptive legislation already, and probably a dozen more bills will move through legislatures this year to varying degrees of success.
So what does the ideal home sharing bill look like?
Well, at the state level, I think we grapple with a lot of the issues that TNCs do. We face a patchwork of regulation, and even though our product and our service isn't mobile, right? Home ownership is not stationary. I can own a home here in Austin, or I can own a home in Westlake, or in San Marcos, or in Port A, and my regulation then is going to be different, and the investment's going to be different. And then as a traveler, my choice of where I get to go and spend my dollars and invest in those communities is limited, and it's different. So at the state level, I think you have to have a strong statewide framework for what cities can and cannot do, not taking away their regulatory authority altogether. Regulation in this atmosphere is appropriate, but really setting boundaries and guidelines for what appropriate and responsible, fair, effective regulation looks like.
So here's a silly question. If cities already have the ability to regulate noise, trash, excessive partying behavior, I mean, don't they already have the tools in place then to properly govern this particular activity?
Yes. Yes, they do. Through discovery of the lawsuit that TPPF has engaged in with relation to short-term rentals, we showed that over the course of 3 years, I think it was 2012 to 2015, the city of Austin didn't issue a single citation for noise, parking, trash, over-occupancy for short-term rentals. Not a single citation. In that same time frame, they only issued a total of 10 violations related to short-term rental use. So instead of really focusing on all the tools that they had at their disposal to enforce the good law that they had already, that was on the books and achieving very high compliance, generating a lot of tax revenue, they decided to ban the activity instead.
And so the reception at the Capitol last time when conservatives mounted, I thought, a fairly good offense to get some good government reforms in place.
Sure.
You know, I think they may have fallen a little short of our goal. Are you more optimistic about our chances next session? Is this kind of a multi-session thing where you introduce it one time and then get something done next time?
I think so. I think so. Very few states have passed one of these bills the first go around. The TNC bill in Florida alone, I think, took, what, 5 or 6 years? 4? Yeah. And so we're very optimistic, because Austin is no longer the only city that's abusing its authority. We have half a dozen other cities that are now preventing you from renting out your home in residential areas or or requiring you to jump through some really ridiculous, burdensome requirements in order to do so.
Senator, I would ask you about preemption legislation for this particular issue, but it seems to me, kind of hearkening back to what Governor Abbott said about, instead of taking single issue rifle shots, maybe it's time for something broad-based that applies across the board. Is that kind of your sense of things?
I think that'd be I think it's a great idea the governor has. I think it's something we should take up and try to get done. Last session, we did pass the preemption bill for, short-term rentals. The Senate did, the Senate passed it. So I think that dynamics in the legislature are going to be different this coming up session. So I do feel like we can get that out, hopefully, over to the governor to sign. So I think it's going to have a different perspective this session.
Councilmember, this issue is interesting to me from a kind of a political perspective as well, because it seems like, at least on this one particular issue, neighborhood groups exercise an outsized influence on council, just with respect to not wanting short-term rentals in their area. Is that kind of your sense of things as well?
Yeah, and I mean, if there truly is a bad actor in your neighborhood that is hosting a bachelor party every weekend where they have 20 people staying in a 3-bedroom house and they're up until 4 a.m. Drinking outside and making noise, that is a legitimate nuisance issue. But as Ashley said, there are already existing regulations in place that the city should be using. They shouldn't enforce any regulations any differently against that house than the house next door that is a full-time rental, that has a tenant. Why are the regulations different for somebody who rents their house for 29 days versus 30 days? It just, where is the difference there? And it's scary that some of the other cities are now following the bad example that the city of Austin has set, because of how completely ineffectively it's actually addressing the issue. Just to put it in perspective, in 2015, and the year before the council took up these regulations, there were 505 complaints against short-term rentals in the city. Only 38% of them were against full-time short-term rentals. So less than half of the complaints even dealt with the full-time short-term rentals that the city council ended up banning. And out of that 38%, the majority were only against 4 properties. So we are literally talking about a handful of properties that have been a major issue for their neighbors. And instead of using the tools that are available to us to make sure that those property owners get in line with city regulations that apply to everybody, regardless of whether you own your home or rent your home or what, they really did throw the baby out with the bathwater and affected all of the other people in the city who were using their homes as a source of revenue. So it is seriously concerning, and I hope that the legislature will find a way to address it.
And of course, I believe it's 2022 where the city effectively bans Type 2 short-term rentals. So people have effectively lost that ability to engage in that kind of activity altogether.
Yeah, and of course it hasn't actually impacted. Ashley might know the exact statistic, but I would be very surprised if the actual number of short-term rentals has decreased in the city because of these new regulations. It's just, they're still doing it, they're just not registering and doing it under the radar, which of course is a sign of really ineffective regulations. It's funny, I'm a residential realtor as well as serving on the city council, and so all the time I have clients who are looking for investment properties. They live in Austin, but they're looking for a way to help pay their rising property tax bills on their existing homes, and they ask me about short-term rentals, and they are really shocked and disappointed when I tell them it's really not an option for them right now. So I hope that I think it's a private property rights issue, and I think that there is a way to resolve it.
And of course, it's not just the property owners and those who would seek to rent those properties who are hurt. The city also charges a fairly substantial hotel occupancy tax
right.
on those properties, which is close to 19%. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's 15, 17%. Yeah.
All said and done.
17.
It's
17.
It's a pretty hefty fee. So you would think that it would be in the city's best interest to make sure that short-term rentals are registered and are paying that tax to the city.
Ashley, are there any states out there that have done it right when it comes to short-term rentals?
Well, you know, Florida was the first state to pass a preemptive law, and just they did that in 2011 just by virtue of the fact they really felt as if the backbone of their economy was being nickel and dimed to death at the local level when cities like St. Petersburg and Miami Beach came along and passed these really damaging laws that over time have the effect of could potentially cripple that part of the industry in Florida. So they had to step in. They didn't feel like they had a choice. And their state law is very simple, and it just says cities can regulate, but you can't regulate the frequency or duration of the stay. Meaning you can't say you can only do it this many times a year, or it has to be a minimum of 7 days or 30 days. And that's been relatively effective in Florida. Arizona also has a comprehensive law where they've gone into a little bit more detail about how cities can regulate and making sure they're comfortable with the tools that they have to be able to address the issue.
Good. All right, Trevor, as someone who grew up on Back to the Future and The Fifth Element and some of these other fantastic sci-fi movies, I have to ask about Jetsons, exactly, about autonomous aerial vehicles and what the public policy implications of having things zoom around the air are.
Yeah, so you're referencing our Uber Elevate program, which we announced in Dallas, Dubai, and recently Los Angeles. And the goal is to have VTOLs, which are vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, flying around these cities by 2023 doing commercial flights. You know, I think at Uber we've recognized that if you're not innovating for tomorrow, you'll go away. And you know, self-driving and vertical takeoff and landing vehicles are the future of where urban and rural transportation are going, and we need to be in that space if we want to stay relevant. And so, the program is basically partnering with aircraft manufacturers, helicopter manufacturers. Bell Helicopters is a partner, Aurora, Embraer. And then partnering with real estate providers, which we're partnering with Hillwood in the Dallas area, to build vertical takeoff and landing pads. We're working with DFW Airport as well. And then basically the idea is the aircraft manufacturers and the helicopter manufacturers would make these vertical takeoff and landing vehicles and then deploy them on the Uber network. So much like we think about self-driving vehicles, I don't think Uber contemplates owning a fleet of flying cars or self-driving cars. We think somebody else will do that, and we will be the network by which they are deployed. And so, yeah, so basically we've been working with NASA and the FAA to figure out what the rules and regulations will be on flying vehicles and how they operate. And so we're just kind of in the initial stages of it. I think states and cities are starting to take notice now. But what I can say is the legislature, I think, was very proactive this session with SB 2205 that Senator Hancock and Nichols worked on, which basically preempted cities from regulating self-driving. Because Senator Hancock was very adamant that you know, the industry didn't want much regulation on self-driving vehicles, and we didn't want the state to pass anything initially. But Senator Hancock said, look, I understand that, but you're going to be back here in a year or two after cities start regulating this, saying, hey, can we override them? And so I think what the legislature did, and Senator Huffines was big on this, was said, hey, we're going to bring this industry here, but we're going to set the rules now, knowing what the problems could be in the future. And so I think as we kind of progress on the Uber Elevate program, you're going to start to see states and cities think through how these should be regulated, if at all, on the local level, understanding that the FAA is going to have a big say in how this happens.
So are there any regulatory hurdles that you guys are anticipating, be it here in Texas or elsewhere?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the big challenges to vertical takeoff and landing vehicles that the industry is working on is noise. And so, you know, many of these vehicles will have multiple rotors, so if one fails, it doesn't crash like a helicopter. But one of the big challenges is battery power and storage, as well as noise. So I could certainly see a world, and we're thinking through a world in which we have to figure out what noise ordinances look like, and are we hitting a certain decibel level when we fly over a residential neighborhood? And so, yeah, there's a lot of various kind of policy implications that come into it, but we're just in kind of the development phase, thinking on what those challenges may be.
That's fantastic. Senator?
I would just say that this technology is coming, and it's coming really fast. You have it in China, you've got it around the world, a lot of companies competing in this space, and so everybody needs to be ready. And there's designs out there with 10 rotors, 15 rotors. I think yours had 3 or 4 rotors. But and the ultimate goal on this, of course, is pilotless vehicles. And so you don't have to worry about who's flying it. Nobody, computer's flying it. But it's so much safer when you have a computer. The carnage on the roads is unimaginable we have right now. We have 45,000 plus Americans dying a year. We have 3,700 Texans dying. We have 250,000 major injuries in Texas because of cars. But 96% of all those crashes is driver related. Let me tell you, when we're going to cut the carnage down, is when we have computers driving these things, and they obviously can put on the brake 1,000,000 times faster than a human. So I'm very excited about where the future is going. The technology is taking us, and it's going to be a safer and more productive world than we can even imagine. Of course, that's going to displace a lot of people, right? But that's the beauty of capitalism. That's the beauty of free market. And so I'm just real excited about it.
And kind of building off that particular statement, I think there may be a thought process there that autonomous vehicles could help ease traffic congestion. And
absolutely, they're going to help.
That's one of the issues as someone who's frequently stuck on I-35. I think about the day when autonomous vehicles finally arrive. Trevor?
They're coming quick, and I also want to point out about the Hyperloop. I went to the pod competition at Texas A&M. Texas is a leader in new technology for transportation, and that was 2 summers ago. They had the pod competition for the Hyperloop. That's like a pneumatic tube. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but you get in it. It's like, you put your checks at the drive-in bank, and they go in, and imagine that, sitting in one. That's the same thing. Well, it's Elon Musk's deal. The test track is built. The technology works. It's out there in Hawthorne, California. The Aggies put together a great program. Those pods are on the test track now, and Texas is in the finalists to have the first track built. And it's going to be in the Texas Triangle, Dallas, San Antonio, Houston, back to Dallas. They go 700 miles an hour, and the pods will hold. They haven't totally been designed, but from 8 to 20 people. And so it's mainly for long distance travel, not short travel.
Very exciting future in front of us. Well, let me stop asking so many questions now, and I want to bring the audience into the conversation. I know we have a roving mic out here. If we could begin with the ladies first, why don't we? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Bridge Bertram. I'm also a city councilwoman, but for the city of Lakeway. It's kind of really a neat opportunity to see all this going on, so thank you. I have a question about short-term rentals because we were affected a bit this year just with the hubbub going on. And I want to ask what precautions are being written into policy to maintain property values, but more importantly, to avoid investors coming in and buying a block of desirable homes and losing our sense of community. I think that's what we're afraid of, is in some of these places like Lakeway, where there's desirable homes, we don't want somebody coming in and buying an entire block of lakefront property and losing that sense of community. Does that make sense?
Ashley, Senator, you guys want to take a stab at that?
Have you seen that happen?
Yes. Well, no, not yet, because we put a stop to it. Yeah, we've got city ordinances in place where they can't.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Lakeway's policy. Yeah, you also have a cap on the number of permits, I believe, that you issue in total. What was that, 25? 25 for the entire city of Lakeway. Yeah. It is a legitimate concern. quality of life issues are intrinsic to our sense of community and our sense of home and our sense of security. And I believe that most, if not the vast majority of short-term rental owners and managers are sensitive to that because they're members of a neighborhood and they're members of a community. If Lakeway were to turn into Bourbon Street, you would no longer have the desirability that makes Lakeway Lakeway. So we also have a vested interest in keeping your community a community. That being said, there are regulatory tools that can be exercised, such as your distance limitation, such as Austin tried census cap limitations, any number of anti-proliferation and anti-clustering devices that still provide a pathway to be able to participate legally in short-term rental without, opening the floodgates and really causing concern among these communities. I've yet to see a community that a foreign investor has come in and bought up a neighborhood and turned it into like a de facto hotel. It's not the nature of a short-term rental. Our demographics also look vastly different than your typical hotel demographic. You have primarily families, larger groups staying for a longer period of time. They're not being constantly turnover like you would in a hotel. On average, these homes rent out for 90 days or less a year in total. So we believe it's a little bit of a different animal. I think that argument, while valid, can sometimes cause a knee-jerk reaction to regulation, and that's what we're really trying to avoid.
Senator, did you want to add anything?
There is a balance out there, and it's a delicate dance you got to do, but we need to always err on property rights and the free market.
And I guess I would just say that I could see somebody having the same concern about long-term rentals. I don't know, that's the way that I always approach this issue is, would this be an appropriate fear or regulation for a long-term rental, something that is rented on a yearly basis? I don't think that cities that I know of have regulations stopping people from buying up an entire block and making an entire community a long-term rental community. So I don't know why that would be a fear when it came to short-term rentals. I don't see the difference there. But the way that the city of Austin has, I guess, addressed that is put in place a census tract cap. I think that you can't have more than 3% in a particular census tract of short-term rental permits. But if it's not an issue or a fear in a long-term rental, I doubt that it's an issue or a fear in a short-term rental.
Yeah. Bearing in mind that short-term rentals in most urban areas represent less than 1% and usually well below less than 1% of total available housing units.
Yes, ma'am. Did you have a question?
My question's for Trevor. I think we all admire Uber's ability to their dispatch system that they've built and put in place on their app. And one thing that I got to thinking about as I was helping out with rescue efforts during Hurricane Harvey was that this would be a platform that could be really useful in a disaster situation like that, where someone is stranded or trapped, and their status needs to be tracked. We need to know where they are, and also prevent redundant dispatch. And I was wondering if Uber has made any, has looked into working with rescuers to use their dispatch platform in scenarios like this.
Yeah, it's a great question. We certainly have. When I started Uber, I came from the Louisiana Recovery Authority, which was the state entity that was set up to rebuild after Katrina and Rita. And my first question was, how can we use Uber to rescue people during floods or hurricanes? We actually worked closely with the city of Houston and the National Guard to try and do just that. It was kind of a late-ish. We were too late to get the product off the ground, and there was a lot of engineering and liability issues that we had to deal with. The challenge for us is that the drivers are independent contractors, and we don't want to put them in harm's way either, saying, hey, we want you or encourage you to go save your fellow citizen to evacuate them, because then we'll have multiple stranded people. So, but what we are thinking through is Facebook does this well of market and check if you're safe, right? The big challenge that the National Guard and the Cajun Navy had during the hurricane was when we go out, we get a report that somebody's stranded, but we don't know where they are. The street signs aren't showing, and so we just go out there and hope. So the idea is that you could, through the app and our GPS technology, indicate where you are and put out a call for help, and then we have somebody who's sitting in the control room with National Guard and everybody else and says, hey, we're getting a ping from this location, send somebody out there and check. So that's what we're kind of working through. We certainly understand that our technology can be used for a variety of uses, and anytime we can help in a disaster, we certainly do. But what we did during the hurricane was we gave free rides to and from every shelter in the state. So this allowed people who were in shelters to take a free Uber to go to the grocery store, visit family, come back to the shelter, family members go visit them. And so we're trying to think through how to best harness the technology, so we're not trying to solve every problem, but focus the resources on where we can specifically help. And we have a whole team dedicated to figuring out how we can be better, use our technology better in disasters. It's a great question.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Trevor, before I ask the question, I do want to inspire you not to get rid of your drivers. I don't mind the driverless cars, but I want somebody to talk to, so don't get rid of all of them. But my question is to Ashley, and it's just ignorance on my part. What is the definition of a short-term rental, and when does it become a long-term rental?
That's a great question, Commissioner. It varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. On average, it's defined as the use of a home for transient lodging for fewer than 30 days at a time.
Okay, so, but it changes from, would it be helpful if it was a defined definition?
It would be very helpful to have a statewide definition classifying it as a residential use for transient lodging. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes, sir. If we can go right here to Mr. Don Dixon.
Excuse me.
As a private pilot, who's going to have the right of way if you have a pilotless airplane? The private pilot or the pilotless airplane?
It's a great question. I think that's exactly what we're working with the FAA now. But just to clarify, on the 2023 timeline and the Uber Elevate program as we imagine it now, there will be human pilots in those vehicles. Pilotless, like the center reference, is coming. I think it's a little further out than 2023, obviously.
Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, I wanted to do on short-term rentals. I just wanted to comment the bill that the Senate passed actually was referred to a House committee that was chaired by the former president of the Texas Municipal League, where it died. But my question for either the HomeAway rep or for Councilmember Troxclair is, would either of you care to comment on the enforcement powers that the city of Austin assumed for itself in the short-term rental ordinance that was passed in 2016?
Let's go to the back.
Do you mean specifically the provision allowing code enforcement to enter the home with or without the permission of the owner?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, can you repeat that for those of us who may not be familiar with the Austin ordinance?
Yeah, there's a provision in the law, and I forgive me, I can't remember exactly what it says, but it does allow code enforcement to enter the home at any time without a warrant, without the permission of the people present or the owner.
And I don't think that it prohibits somebody, and this is a code enforcement. It's city staff. It's not, it's not a police officer. That doesn't prevent them from going in your house and noting other code violations that they might find while they're in there. So that was very disturbing to me to think that we were authorizing city staff to come investigate at any moment into my home and see if I'm operating as a short-term rental and what other city violations I I might have. Really, really concerning.
There are some Fourth Amendment concerns.
It's extremely unconstitutional. It's actually one of the reasons why TPPF is suing the city of Austin to overturn this particular ordinance.
And
Just
I know
one of the reasons.
Meg has had her hand up, and Rachel too, for
Yeah.
a while. So.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. This is for Trevor. What kind of research and process goes into place to decide on where VTOLs will be launched first, like Dallas, LA, Dubai, you said? How do you make that decision? When can they come to Austin? And if they are leaving Dallas, does that mean that we're going to have landing pads here for them to come from Dallas to Austin, or how does that work?
So I think the first evaluation we did was places that have heavy congestion, have a real estate climate that would allow us to partner with landowners who have large tracts, geographically placed in a metro area. So Frisco and Arlington was kind of key to that. LA was because of the Olympics. We want to get off for the Olympics that were just announced in LA, ideally. And because of Dallas's aviation history with Bell helicopters being there, and so that was important for us. But yes, ideally, the future that we see in Texas specifically is where you can take a vertical takeoff and landing vehicle from Dallas and get to Houston or Austin or San Antonio in a quick manner. So we certainly want to expand to other cities. We needed kind of few test cities to figure that out. I'll tell you, I mean, a big part of having Uber Elevate locate in Dallas and to try there first was the regulatory climate. And the legislature's actions last session kind of said, hey, we're open for business, not only on ride sharing, but self-driving. And so, that was a major focus of why we picked Dallas. And I'll just say, I mean, from the regulatory environment, it is certainly the ride-sharing HB 100 bill that passed. We were looking at that not only for an indication of can we do our core business, which is ride-sharing, but can we believe that ride-sharing is the way that you scale self-driving. So you have to have good ride-sharing regulations in place to start implementing the self-driving vehicles into the network so that you can scale self-driving. Because like I mentioned before, I don't think we see a world in which people own their own self-driving vehicle. The average car sits idle 95% of the time. And so we see self-driving vehicles being shared and deployed on a network.
Yes, sir.
I hope you all don't ever have the problem of trying to understand the financial reporting and accounting systems used by mass transit authorities, primarily in Texas too. But if you did, you would find that the fare box typically collects less than 10% of the cost of any ride.
Absolutely.
And I want to know why maybe we couldn't get Don and Trevor to team up and offer some sort of a voucher-based alternative for transit-dependent people, which would provide them door-to-door service at less cost than the monster behemoth dinosaurs that were running around the city half empty most of the time.
It's a great question, and what I'll tell you is that we are having conversations with transit agencies across the country, including Texas. I have a meeting next week with one about we are forcing transit agencies who've never had to innovate and rethink how they get people around and how they use their resources. And it's very, as you mentioned, it's very expensive to run transit service as well as paratransit service. And is there a way to partner with them and have a public-private partnership where we're leveraging those dollars? Congress is about to pass another disaster supplemental for Harvey, and there's a lot of funding in there for transit agencies who were affected by the disaster. And we've been working with the Secretary of Transportation and the FTA to see if we can free up some of those funds to do innovative partnerships with transportation network companies so that we can do just that.
Yeah, the biggest threat to public transportation is the ride-sharing industry. Yeah, that's just a fact. It's only a matter of time before the ride-sharing companies put the public transportation industry out of business. But it's government. Man, it is so hard to get rid of government. Let me tell you, it just doesn't matter how big or small. It is really difficult. So they're not going to go down easy. Hopefully they're smart and they can transition to what works economically better, which is about everything. So we'll see.
Yes, sir. Right in the back.
So whatever we may say here, but according
Sorry,
to
sir, can you speak up just a little bit?
According to the self-rule powers of the city, of every city at some point is as powerful as the state, unless you prohibit, the state prohibits the city from doing certain things, because city has self-rule powers. So my question is, if we limit, like for sharing, especially for sharing, if we limit the city's power, the self-rule powers in sharing, that in a broad category, through a broad set of categories, then we do not have to go through one at a time. Okay, now it is the home, now it is the boat, now it is the car. If we make a broader law that this cannot be part of your self-rule taxes, etc. And to give you an example, tomorrow you all are going to pass a law whereby to have block parties in city of Austin, we will need a permit. So that's basically where my question originates.
Senator, I think this kind of goes back to Governor Abbott's call for more of a broad-based push against some of these pernicious local regulations.
Well, there's a lot of sharing. The sharing economy is just going to grow. There's different technology, like sharing when you move. There's companies out there that help you move with a pickup, or help you move with a truck. So you can share that on the apps. There's all kinds of technology, uses for the cell phone to have sharing economy. So I completely agree. We should do a statewide preemption on all political subdivisions of what they can regulate or not. If we can't get that done, then we definitely need to shoot at every one we can, and hopefully we're successful in preempting the political subdivisions. I would say this, a lot of people say local control, but local control is not a blank check, and when they interfere with your economic liberty, it's just as important for you to have a job as it is to be free, right? And that's when the state legislature is going to step up and do something about it.
And just as a follow-up, that absolutely, the emails that I received after the ride-sharing vote and the short-term rental vote at the City of Austin absolutely proved to me that the local regulations were negatively impacting the statewide economy. I got an email from a business owner that was planning to relocate to Austin with 1,200 employees that made a decision not to relocate here because of the hostility of the local government. There were travelers who emailed and said, hey, we were planning on visiting Austin. We don't know how we're going to get around now, so we're going to go to Florida instead. There were just a whole host of of people who contacted my office saying we were going to bring tourism tax dollars to your state, and we're going to take them elsewhere now. So I really felt that in a very tangible way when I heard from people who made those decisions. Oh, and investors too. I had people from Silicon Valley saying, I wanted to invest in the sharing economy and the startups that are going on in Austin, and because of hostility of the local government, we're no longer going to invest in those venture capital funds. So it's a big issue.
The ramifications are massive. Yeah. When the government steps in, it distorts the market always. It's going to distort it. The question is how much it's going to distort it. And people always say, well, what about local control? Does the legislature have the authority? And the answer is absolutely the legislature's got the authority to regulate political subdivisions. Then it not only has the authority, it's got the obligation to oversee these out-of-control political subdivisions, and hopefully we'll continue with that down here at the Capitol going next session.
Why don't we head over here? We've got time for a few more questions. Yes, sir.
Okay, I'll give you the microphone next. Okay, Dennis Borrell, Coalition of Texans with Disabilities. How do you see providers in the sharing economy, whether it's transportation or housing, meeting the accessibility needs of their customers with disabilities?
Yeah, I can take that. In HB 100, as you know, there was a provision to have a pilot program on wheelchair accessible vehicles for people who are in fixed frame wheelchairs. We have two. We have one in Austin and one in Houston, where we contract with third-party fleet owners of wheelchair vehicles. And in the city of Austin and city of Houston, anybody in a fixed frame wheelchair can push a button and get a wheelchair accessible vehicle in a matter of minutes, where previously through transit agencies they had to wait 24 hours. So it's changing the lives of the way that people get around. I think self-driving vehicles is going to change that even better. I think one of the other things we announced in Houston with the Mayor's Office on Disability last month, that we're now going to allow on the Uber network in Austin and Houston, if a family member or somebody owns a wheelchair accessible vehicle on their own, they can now drive it on the Uber platform, make extra money to pay for that really expensive vehicle, and also at the same time give rides to those in fixed frame wheelchairs. So the app is fully integrated for those with vision impairments and hearing impairments, and it's a big part. But I think we're doing great things now, but self-driving vehicles, blows open the potential for those with disabilities to move around.
But it's not just Uber. There's a lot of companies out there that can innovate to represent just the disabled community, or there's a company that opened in Dallas, a ride-sharing company, that only has retired police officers as drivers. And they're actually doing quite well because a lot of people really want to feel safe, and so they Uber or use their app to get that company to come pick them up. So it would be the same with disabled. When you have a real free market and you level the playing field, the consumer is going to decide what works and doesn't work, not 181 know-it-alls down here at the Capitol.
Yes, ma'am.
Meg Wilson. My question's a little bit broader, and I think I'm directing it at the Senator and Councilwoman. I think of it as a user-based economy as opposed to just sharing. So we've got the rides, we've got HomeAway, we've got online banking, we've got crowdfunding, whether it's credit or debt, or somebody working a trade with somebody else, barter systems, you name it. We've got new currencies, so that Bitcoin is the kind of thing that's proliferating to local levels and beyond. So part of my question is, how do you what kind of a process does the state or the city have to track new technologies so that we, in fact, the kinds of regulations and laws that are passed match the new technology and the new economy? And at what point can we start asking those questions and responding in such a way that we don't over-regulate and kill something before it has a chance to grow?
I'll take that. That's the point, is that we can pass statewide dereg for the political subdivisions and what works and doesn't, what authority they have or don't have, or we can just stay out of the way, and hopefully the cities will stay out of the way also and let the disruptive technology take shape and be creative and disruptive. I mean, that's the point. So to answer your question, there is no definitive timeline, except the more the government gets out of the way, the more creativity we can have with innovators and disruptors.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say that the city doesn't have really any kind of process in place to be tracking these new technologies. And in fact, if I'm part of an industry, say there's like a chef, you can, there's apps now where a private chef can, you don't have time to make dinner that night, you can get a private chef to come to your house. And so now, well, do they need to be fingerprinted? Does your kitchen need to be a commercial kitchen? I mean, in fact, I feel like the city of Austin is to a point where these new emerging apps, technologies, whatever, like you don't want the city to find out about them because you're scared. You're scared about what kind of new ways that they're going to come up to regulate you. So yeah, I mean, I share the sentiments of the senator that really that's not our job. Our job is to kind of figure out how we can support, with the exception of maybe basic. I mean, I say basic health and safety stuff, but that can turn into that can be really misconstrued and misused. So really, I would say there's no process in place, and hopefully the city will get into a mindset where we're more receptive to the new ideas that the entrepreneurs are coming up with to make all of our lives kind of more easier and more convenient.
Terry?
I just wanted to say it's Terry Hall with Texans for Toll-Free Highways. And something that we've had a big concern with our supporters for a while now is we're hearing rumblings that Uber, Lyft, rideshare companies are kind of teaming up with big government to push restricted lanes, whether it's toll lanes, HOV lanes, or what have you, where you get a competitive advantage over the consumer free market or just ordinary taxpayer by elevating that mode by giving you a restricted lane or access to those lanes. Because your ride share, you get a fast express ride, whereas those of us who may not choose to travel that way get stuck in unbearable congestion. And we know that Senator Huffines has been on the front lines being a champion against toll roads for that reason, but we're a little hesitant to see a certain industry team up with potentially big government to restrict the freedom and liberty of everybody traveling.
So it's a good question. I mean, I think, what we do advocate for is more butts and seats. So the idea that people are traveling together and sharing a ride instead of traveling on their own. And we think that there needs to be incentives for that. And so pricing is one, lane usage is another. But we believe that when people start to share rides and think of transportation as a service instead of driving a single occupancy vehicle, that's when we start to move the needle on changing behavior so that we can reduce congestion. We can build all the lanes that we want. We're never going to keep up with the problem. And we believe that if we're competitive with car ownership and it becomes cheaper to take an Uber than it is to own a car, that's a good thing for everybody. Obviously, you have the choice whether you want to keep your car or not. We're trying to incentivize the reduction in car ownership and the betterment of congestion, and we think pricing, lanes, that sort of thing is the way to do that.
All right, if we can get this one last gentleman, we'll get this last question and then call it a day. Yes, sir.
Man, last question, no pressure. I guess my question is to Ms. Hodgini from HomeAway. Can you talk a little bit about, do y'all put your customers, your clients, whatever you want to call them, in some sort of a box when it comes to specific regulations that they can put on users or renters of their home outside of either the state law or a city ordinance? I know when I've stayed in cities all over the country, in HomeAway or VRBO, things like that, Airbnb, some people have parking ordinances or noise ordinances, occupancy limits, things like that. Do y'all have a set of those that you ask people to put in place, or is it pretty open-ended? Because I can see to the council member from Lakeway, to her concern, homeowners would probably be incentivized to not upset their neighbors and to keep their property values up by not letting things run amok at their house.
They are by and large incentivized, and most of our owners and property managers have what we call a set of house rules that they keep, and they, sometimes they stick them on the fridge, sometimes they put them in the advertisement for their home, and it just says, hey, I don't allow parties, or I don't allow pets, or please don't bring more than one vehicle, or please be advised that these are quiet hours. Here's my emergency contact information. A lot of cities and states are starting to utilize some of that and codify it, meaning you've got to provide your guests with the local noise restrictions and the trash collection schedule, things of that nature. As a platform, we don't require that of our owners. We feel like they are the best judges of how their property should be used. But certainly if there are repeat nuisance issues with a home that's listing on our site, we would investigate and take it very seriously. We have a program called Stay Neighborly, and it allows us, through our acceptable use policies, to take action against an owner that is really just shown to be a repeat offender, if you will, and disruptive to their community. And we'll work on our platform to make sure that that doesn't happen, and I know other platforms are doing the same.
Would everyone help me thank this great group? Real quickly, before everyone leaves, two last matters of housekeeping. For my lawyers in the audience, there is a CLE document in the back if anyone's interested in signing that and gaining credit. And then the second issue is we are launching as a foundation something called the Texas Prosperity Promise. We're unifying behind a small set of principles that we're going to push very hard behind in the next legislative session, dealing with things like taxpayer-funded lobbying, property tax reform, balancing the budget in a reasonable way. If you're interested in joining us and having your voice added to that particular document, please go to TexasProsperityPromise.com and sign our petition. Your help is greatly needed. Thank you all.